This next section is called Call It Out. What do you do? How do you deal with issues that arise? And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Loughlin Deegan, who is going to facilitate this session for us. Loughlin Deegan is known to many of you. He is currently the director of the LIR, the Academy, the National Academy of Theatre Arts at Trinity College, and he's former director of Dublin Theatre Festival. He has also worked with Rough Magic Theatre Company. He has worked, very proud to say, with Irish Theatre Institute, where he was the editor of the Irish Theatre Handbook and our irishplayography.com resource. He also has venue management and marketing experience from his days at the Bell Table Theatre. And he is also a playwright, whose credits include The Stomping Ground and The Queen and Peacock. So we felt that Loughlin, as steward of a next generation of theatre makers, and with his own experience, was an ideal individual and professional to facilitate this session for us. So I'm going to invite Loughlin to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to speak from the cheap seats, if that's okay. So I'm really happy to facilitate this conversation. I suppose, I've been, as so many of us in the room have been, I've been kind of an active participant in a conversation that I suppose I regard started with by Liam Bell's enormously courageous call out on Facebook back in early 2016. I think we need to acknowledge, as indeed the Minister touched on earlier, that bullying in particular and harassment is not limited by gender, both in terms of the perpetrators and the victims. But as Andrea rightly said, at the heart of the problem I think that we're trying to identify and solve is gender inequality. And so for me, this starts with Waking the Feminists, actually, and I don't think certainly in Ireland, and I don't think we would be here today if it wasn't for that action. And I think to some extent, although we're acknowledging difficulties and challenges, we need to be proud of ourselves as a sector. I think the theatre community has been in the spotlight, as the Minister said, but I think we've been the front riders. I think we know that this is not limited to theatre. We know it's not just limited to theatre as an art form, but also that it applies to every sector in society, as Andrea rightly said. So I think we need to acknowledge that, the solutions that we're proposing here today and that we are going to find as a sector and that we're determined to implement across everything we do is going to become a blueprint, not only for other art forms, but hopefully wider within society. I suppose, I've been committed to putting my shoulder to the wheel with the view that we can genuinely engender change. So I suppose, Jane and Siobhán asked me to talk just briefly, I suppose, about the view from the LIR Academy. And I suppose going back to Waking the Feminists, a number of organisations coming out of the last public meeting of Waking the Feminists committed to sitting down as individual organisations and work together to devise gender equality policies that were unique to our own organisations, but that we would, in the spirit of, I suppose, of collegiality and a sharing of knowledge and information and challenges and difficulties, we would do that work together with a view to, I suppose, to having policies that were unique to our own organisations, but then that we would share publicly, and that by having a disparate group of organisations in the room, they would become templates, hopefully, for other organisations who are looking at the issue of gender equality and how they could address gender equality within their own organisations. Initially, we were comprised of the LIR, the Cork Midsummer Festival, the Everyman Palace, Fishamble, the Abbey, Corn Exchange and Rough Magic, and then we were subsequently joined by Druid, The Gate and DTF, Dublin Theatre Festival. So there's a lot of the most significant theatre organisations in the country have been working together for over a year now and have very advanced drafts of gender equality policies ready to share. And to some extent we are going to be sharing those publicly and having a public event around that, but obviously the Me Too movement, and particularly the accusations of bullying and sexual harassment in Irish theatre, in many ways stopped our gallop in terms of an acknowledgement that we although some of us already had quite robust bullying and harassment and dignity at work policies in place, we needed to actually to stop and to reflect and to look back on those documents to make sure that they were robust, to improve on them, to ensure that they were living, breathing, organic documents that were influencing every aspect of how we worked, and that they needed to be acknowledged and cross-referenced in our gender equality policies, because the two issues are not separate, and they are completely, as I'm concerned, they are conjoined. So we are, I suppose, there's an opportunity there, I think, for us as a sector to consider the opportunity, I suppose, that the templates that are to follow, how they can contribute, I suppose, to a code of conduct for the whole theatre sector. And I suppose as a I'm here today very much, I suppose, realising the opportunity that this day presents for us to complete that work. I suppose, talking particularly as the director of the Lir Academy, we've been very struck by, I suppose, how we, as an institution that to some extent is mandated to help to secure the future of Irish theatre, how would we respond appropriately. And our board, and particularly our chair, Dermot McCrum, has invested a lot of time and energy in answering that question as well. And I suppose we are focused on the structures that Grace talked about. We are focused on policies and codes of behaviour and making sure that they are adequate and robust. But also there's an opportunity, I think, within the Lir Academy to, in a very positive and constructive way, to look at how, through the curricula themselves, we can empower a new generation. Both not only, I suppose, to speak out up and call it out, but also both in terms of working with both the young men and the young women who are the future of our industry, to kind of engender a sense of decency and professionalism, and an appropriate way to be in this industry, an appropriate way to work and to act and to behave. And I think there's a real opportunity there. So we are, by the end of this academic year, looking at organising for the first time. I'm somewhat, disappointed to say we're going to be putting active workshops in place for the students to kind of, to facilitate that process, I suppose, and to see it genuinely as an opportunity. But the other thing I'd say to you about the Lir Academy is we talk a lot, which I'm sure you'd appreciate, about the balance between, I suppose, the students feeling empowered as the next generation who genuinely acknowledge and feel ownership of the fact that they are going to change the industry and shape the industry when they graduate and when they start to work professionally. And we talk a lot, I suppose, about facilitating that process while also acknowledging that there needs to be a sense of realism in terms of being able to work within the industry as it's currently constructed in terms of working practices. But one of the things I've become increasingly aware of, I suppose, as a result of Me Too and the work that's happening here in Ireland, is an increased, you won't be surprised to hear it, kind of politicisation and militism within the student body around this issue in particular. And a realisation, I suppose, on our part that when you empower the next generation, you don't quite know whether or not the balance it will be maintained. And you actually give people the opportunity to shape the future and to possibly reject the working practices that we have accepted for so long, as Andrea and Grace also acknowledged. And that the change that the next generation might actually engender will make us feel somewhat uncomfortable. And that they will hold us to a higher account, and they will expect different practices and different codes of behaviour. And I think that's something we need to stay aware of. Through Kate Ferris, as many of you will know, who's our head of stage management in the Lir, I suppose we've seen an opportunity for the Lir in particular to look at the aspect of technical theatre and stage management and people working backstage, where I think some of the more pernicious and kind of unacknowledged sexism, abuse and bullying continues to exist in Irish theatre. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face is, I suppose, when time gets most restricted and resources are most limited, particularly around tech times and that desire, as Grace was talking about earlier, just getting the show on. I think that's where the next generation are possibly going to challenge us most, around how we behave and how we respect each other when we're under the most strain and when the circumstances are most difficult. And I think that's something that we're particularly conscious of playing a role in terms of helping, I suppose, to shape a code of conduct for the future. That's all you're going to hear from me. You're going to hear a lot more from, I suppose, the other people who, maybe in terms of the structure of the day, looking at the programme, I see this session as having heard more courageous and remarkable testimony, this is now the opportunity for the people, because of either their position or because of the good work that they're doing, are genuinely in a position to engender change. And to see what, and to have an opportunity to help shape what that might look like. So I'm going to ask Karan Loughlin, who's head of campaigning and equality with SIPTU, which also includes equity, as we know, to come and join us, who's going to make a first presentation on the work that SIPTU are doing. And Sarah Durcan might also join us on stage. Who, if you want to come up now, Sarah, maybe, and take a seat. And then Sarah's going to talk about the work that she and others have been doing with Amplify Women. And then Siobhán and Jane are going to join us and talk particularly about a draft code of conduct that you've all been presented in your packs. And I suppose to talk in very practical terms about what that code might look like. We then hopefully will have about 15 minutes for questions, and my ambition is to give that time as much as possible to yourselves. I have been asked, as Siobhán said earlier, to make sure that people keep their contributions brief, so you will forgive me if I have to be somewhat rude in implementing that, because we want to hear as many comments and questions as possible during that time, and there will be a time again later in the day for further contributions from the floor. So without further ado, if Karen's ready, I'm going to hand over to Karan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Loughlin. I just want to say, first of all, to thank the Irish Theatre Institute for actually inviting me to speak here today. I was actually quite excited about the prospect, but I find myself quite humbled now already before the day really even gets half started by the presentations that came before me this morning. I think we had two marvellous contributions, both from Grace and from Andrea, in terms of the round of the journey that they have been on. And I suppose to some degree I feel that my contribution is going to be a little bit dry, because it's a little bit more technical than that. But nonetheless, I think the kind of thing we're going to talk about in this session actually will help to underpin the work as it goes forward. So just I suppose to start to say to you that prior to 2016, for quite a number of years, in Irish Equity, we had been hearing anecdotally that there was a problem with behaviours and bullying and harassment behaviours in the arts. That's the kind of issue that's actually quite difficult to deal with when you don't have hard evidence, and we all understand why you don't have hard evidence. So we had to try and find a way to do something about it. So because we really felt that the culture and the structure of the work just really didn't facilitate people speaking out. So we decided to do a confidential survey and to ask people about their experiences, to try and establish some facts around it. So we felt that this was necessary, not just because it was a problem, excuse me, not just because we were constantly hearing about the problem, but we were trying to demonstrate that Irish Equity, for its own part, had regrouped. It had suffered some reputational damage a few years before that. So we wanted to signal that, yes, we were regrouping, yes, we were identifying issues of concern to people, and that we were trying to work with those issues and to try to make efforts to be really part of the solution. So we undertook the survey, and the results of the survey actually were quite alarming, because the situation was far worse than even I had anticipated. So if I can get on to another slide there, I don't know how this works here. Yeah, there we go. I don't know if you can see the figures there, but what the respondents were predominantly women. There was over 65% of people who responded were female. Over 55, and they were predominantly actors. More than half were actors, and more than half as well, about 62%, were working in a freelance, identified themselves as mostly working in a freelance capacity. So that's just to give you a sense of who we were talking to. So over half of the people who responded said that at some time in their working life they had experienced bullying and harassment in their workplace, in the arts. But the interesting thing was that the reporting experience, most people didn't report it. The reporting is as low as 26%, and that's regardless of the structure of the organisation that you were working for. And mostly it was because people were fearful that would interfere with their ability to get work in the future. And I think that would resonate with what was said already here this morning as well. So we were hearing the same thing. So the type of behaviours people were experiencing: ranged from being shouted at regularly, to being intimidated, being the target of aggressive language or obscene language, being socially excluded in the workplace, being isolated in the workplace, or having information deliberately withheld. They were the top, I suppose, the top few that people said they experienced the most. But what I found quite interesting was that while almost 50% of people who responded said they weren't a member of any trade union, about 65% said they actually feel that if being a member of a trade union would be more likely to lead to a successful outcome because of the supports that provides. So so then we went and looked at some international comparisons, because this isn't just an Irish phenomenon, as you know, it's happening all over the world. So what we tend to do in Ireland, because we're an English-speaking territory, is we make comparisons with the other English-speaking territories, namely Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and the USA. So that's what we looked at, and we found that the experiences largely the same everywhere we looked. These other performing organisations had done their own surveys. In the UK, there was a survey done by the Federation of Entertainment Unions, which includes British Equity, the National Union of Journalists, SIPTU, the Musicians Union, and the Writers Guild of Great Britain. And that showed that 56% of people who responded had experienced bullying and harassment at work in the creative industries. That's interesting, because ours was 57%, theirs was 56%. And of this figure, mostly they were women, but less than 1/3 of people reported it. So what you see there on the slide behind you is the larger columns are the numbers experiencing, and the smaller columns are the numbers reporting. In Australia and New Zealand, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance conducted a survey, and they found that over 40% of people said they experienced sexual harassment in the creative industries, and 62% had experienced bullying and harassment. And again, more than half of those people didn't report it. Right? So, and I know that these statistics are a little bit boring, but I think it shows you that the international experience is the same everywhere. In Canada, 50% of women identified as being on the receiving end of bullying behaviour in the workplace, and again, half of them didn't report it. And of those who did report it, almost all, nearly 90%, said that there was either only partial improvement or no improvement at all. So people were inclined to think that, well, even if I do report it, it won't make any difference. In the USA, SAG-AFTRA have initiated what they're calling a stop report support system. So this is to try not just to encourage the person who's experiencing the behaviour to report it, but to encourage people who witness it to speak out and report it as well. So again, the similarity of the international problem is striking. More than half of people working in the industry is experiencing it, more than the majority of them being women, and a very high instance of underreporting. So, and the reasons for all of this, again, were consistent across all of these organisations that we looked at, all of these territories that we looked at. There's the fear of retaliation being the most reported factor. And all of the information in these surveys as well suggests that for performers, the problem begins in the rehearsal room, and that this discussion really needs to happen at induction. It can be done as part of the health and safety protocol, and should include a named person as being responsible for taking reports. It should outline specifically what the fair and supportive processes are. It should facilitate the logging of incidents and provide support for the complainant. But also, we feel very strongly within the union that there should also be consequences for the future employment of offenders, right? And I'm still, I suppose, very much in that black and white place that Grace referred to earlier on. But though I am very struck by her remarks that those behaviours in the workplace are a manifestation of something else, but they are still unacceptable in the workplace. So we have to find a way to deal with it. And if you have people who are not inclined to move with the culture change that we're trying to create, then there has to be a consequence for that. And I think so we need to get some balance around ensuring that we provide support for people to change their behaviours, but that the message is still clear. It is not acceptable to behave like this in the workplace. All workplaces have a safety statement, and you heard that reference as well earlier on. And behaviours can be risk assessed in the very same way as any other hazard at work, because the damage that this behaviour can do to you is as great as the damage that a slip, trip or fall could do, if not greater from a psychological context. There are general duties of employers that extend beyond your relationship with employees, that cover everybody who is within the remit of the organisation for any period of time, and the employers under those circumstances have an obligation, including that extends to freelance workers and anybody else in the environment, to ensure that they're not exposed to risks to their safety, health or their welfare while they're at work. And the legislation is very specific. It is safety, health and welfare. So there must be a clear message also that retaliatory behaviour is not acceptable. So the information that we got really suggests that an absence of highly visible and fair procedures to allow for reporting means that often people don't report because they feel it's useless to report. But there is now, thanks to all of those who've had the courage to speak out, there's a high degree of cooperation internationally between the trade unions operating in the arts, with sharing information and sharing solutions. And I think that this cooperation needs to broaden. And I was happy to hear Loughlin talking about the cooperation between the arts organisations. So I think if the trade unions and the arts organisations are cooperating with all of this information and all of this knowledge on best practice, we might actually be able to move things to a better place. So I suppose I just want to say that I really can't stress enough the importance of everybody, of the need to understand that everybody has an absolute entitlement to be treated with dignity and respect in the workplace, and there actually are no exceptions to that. You have an absolute entitlement to that. It extends to those, it extends beyond the creative processes to everybody in the organisation, to the people who work front of house, people who do the door, people who do the bar, people who do the administration, people on freelance contracts. That extends to everybody. And I also can't emphasise enough the importance, again, of highly visible, fair and supportive policies that contain accountability and responsibility, because that's really the key in my view. And I suggest that organisations should really look at establishing an ethics committee within the organisation to oversee the development and the progress and the effectiveness of those procedures, and to look at engaging the services of directors of intimacy where the type of work being done requires that. And I also would suggest, and have suggested several times, the establishment of a representative body for the theatre industry that will deal with industry-wide matters. This works very effectively in the audiovisual industry, where you can set industry standards and that will contain fair working practices, career structure, progression and transparent standards. And I was very happy to hear again Loughlin say what they're doing in the Lair in terms of the curriculum, because I believe that there should be either workshops or a module in every single drama school, so that the next generation of people coming through will fully understand that these behaviours are not acceptable, but they will also have an intolerance for it, for seeing it or for experiencing it. And I think that's really important if we want to move on to really get out of the place that theatre is in at the moment. And I do believe, again, that the trade union movement has a significant role to play in doing all of this, in pushing for the cultural change that's required, and in trying to support organisations who are doing the right thing. And for those of you who are members of Irish Equity, I would say to you that we have our AGM on Sunday here at 2 o'clock in this building. So you're very welcome to attend that, where we will be continuing to debate some of these issues and to try to move it into an effective place for our own members as well. So thank you for listening, and I'd take any questions later that you'd have. Thank you.
Great. While Sarah's getting ready to speak, Karan, I might just, while you're taking your seat, just ask you one question in response to that. You know, I suppose your great work in terms of, I suppose, identifying the problem has been so useful, I think, in terms of, you know, in terms of providing the facts and figures that kind of have helped blow open the open secret. And I'm just struck by the international comparisons where it seems that other countries are ahead of us in terms of identifying the problem. But I suppose, the question is whether or not you've had any evidence yet of international examples of where people have found the solution or kind of implemented solutions that have genuinely engendered change.
Yeah, well, they're not actually that far ahead of us because, I mean, we did our survey back, we worked on preparing it back in 2015 and we rolled it out then in early 2016. And really some of the other organisations that we looked at, they really weren't doing anything until the Harvey Weinstein thing broke and people started to speak out. And then I think it started to move from there. Everybody appears to be doing the same thing. Like in Australia, they're doing the safe theatre. In the UK, they have procedures around creating without conflict, etc. So everybody is trying to move to a standardised code of behaviour, really, to get cultural change, but nobody has the silver bullet just yet.
Yeah, it would be interesting as well to try and keep tracking those developments as we go in terms of putting structures in place here. Great. I'm going to introduce you now to one of my heroes. Sarah Durcan, I think, has become one of the clearest and loudest voices that we have in terms of gender equality in Irish theatre. We all owe her a debt of gratitude. I think she's speaking today particularly with regard to her work with Amplify Women. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Loughlin, and thanks to Jane and Siobhán at Irish Theatre Institute for taking on the onerous mantle of putting together today. I think we all owe them a debt too. Amplify Women is an umbrella group of organisations and individuals campaigning for gender equality in theatre, film, TV, animation, media and the performing arts. Olwen Daw and Dr. Brenda Donoghue put together the toolkit with expert advice from Ivana Bacek, Katie Cadden, Ciara Kieran and Orla Mannion, and it was designed by Siobhán Griffin, all voluntarily. I have to note that this work should not be left to women alone, and women shouldn't have to volunteer time and expertise to fix a problem which negatively affects us all. It's everyone's responsibility. As Karan and many others have noted, everyone is entitled to respect and dignity in their working life. Unfortunately, harassment and bullying and assault are much more widespread than we like to acknowledge. It affects all genders, races, abilities, sexual orientations, etc. And from what I read when the whole Me Too movement started, and particularly here in Ireland, I unfortunately have to conclude that we also have a problem with homophobic bullying in the theatre, which is extraordinary given how inclusive we consider theatre to be. These issues can happen anywhere there is an imbalance of power, and in the case of gender, that's just about everywhere. However, as we have seen in the US, the UK, and here, the legal, reputational and financial consequences are enormous for organisations that don't swiftly and effectively deal with these issues. And we also need to have a fuller discussion on the sanctions and consequences for perpetrators. To echo Andrea, we can't ensure our industry is accessible, inclusive, diverse and equitable without seriously addressing negative behaviours. So the Amplify Women Toolkit was developed out of an awareness that a lot of people weren't sure what their rights are in employment, what harassment is, what assault is, and what they can do about it. This is very much a guide for individuals. Organisations need to develop and implement their own policies and procedures. There are printed copies of the toolkit in all of your packs this morning with more detailed information, and it is widely available online. So I'll briefly talk through what your rights are if you're an employee and you are a freelancer, types of harassment or treatment, i.e. bullying, sexual harassment or sexual assault, how to make a complaint, including making a complaint under criminal law, and where to get further assistance. Harassment is unwanted conduct which has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity and creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, or humiliating or offensive environment for that person. Bullying is very similar to harassment and can be described as repeated, inappropriate behaviour that undermines your right to dignity at work. It can be done by one or more persons, and it can be aimed at an individual or a group to make them feel inferior to other people. It can take many different forms: verbal, physical, or cyberbullying. Sexual harassment is any form of unwanted verbal, non-verbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And here are some examples. I think this was wonderfully illustrated this morning by Andrea and others. Lots of different behaviour can constitute harassment, especially if it feels inappropriate and is repeated. It can be verbal, i.e. jokes, comments, slagging, or banter that has a belittling context. Written, that's texts, messages, or social media, including apps, emails, or notices. Physical, jostling, shoving, inappropriate touching, or any form of assault. It can include gestures, posturing, or threatening poses to intimidate you. Visual displays, posters, emblems, or badges. Isolation and exclusion from social activities within your work context. And pressure to behave or act in a way that you find inappropriate, i.e. being asked to undress or dress in an inappropriate manner. And harassment in a work context. The Employment Equality Acts require all organisations to have adequate policies and processes in place to promote equality and tackle discrimination, including bullying and harassment. Employers have a duty of care, as Karan has outlined, to employees and freelancers under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005. And again, to echo, these laws apply to all members of staff, including managers, directors, volunteers, or board members of a company or association. Both acts protect all kinds of employees, those on contracts of service, for example, a 5-year contract, or contracts for services, i.e. a freelancer working on a once-off lighting job. Also, if a client or customer or other business contact harasses an employee and the employer has not taken reasonable steps to avoid it, the employer is also liable. What can you do if you experience harassment? Above all, please don't feel alone. Don't feel you have to keep it silent anymore, or there aren't things that you can do about it. There are. Please talk through the issue with a friend and decide how best it is for you to tackle your situation. There are a number of ways of reporting and dealing with harassment. The process for reporting an incident or repeated incidents varies depending on the level of harassment. You have a number of options for reporting incidents in your workplace. So, considering whether to report an incident or not, here are some of the steps you can take. Make a note about the incident, including as many details as you can: when it happened, who was there, what was said, and if you responded, if you did at all, and how you felt afterwards. It can be a good idea to send an email to yourself because it becomes a recorded note of events. Familiarise yourself with your employees' policies and procedures. Any policy should set out what constitutes unacceptable behaviour in the workplace, and there should be an effective complaints procedure. Speak with an appropriate contact within the organisation. Now, we know there are all sorts of different scales of organisation within the theatre, from individual artists who are coming together to make a fringe production to more larger scale organisations. And we need to talk today about what is the appropriate scale of how you can deal with this when you don't necessarily have a structure surrounding you. But if you do, please go and talk to your HR person or manager. And if you have a problem with that person, talk to their supervisor. It's best to register a complaint as close as possible to the time when the last incident occurred, or at least within 6 months. Now, I know this is difficult if there have been serious issues to come back to something, and it takes time to be able to deal with it. But the reason for this 6 months is that it can be investigated properly while events are clear in the memory of everybody involved. Depending on your work arrangements, your employer workplace may offer an informal resolution as a first step of the process. You don't have to accept this, and sometimes an informal approach will not resolve the issues, and the next stage of the process requires you to submit a formal written complaint to an appointed member of staff. Internal investigations will then start, and the alleged perpetrators will be notified in writing. Generally, a person who is considered to be impartial will be appointed to investigate the allegation. In some cases, the organisation may appoint a mediator from outside. The investigation should be governed by a set of guidelines or rules, terms of reference. Ideally, these should be agreed by all involved before the process starts. And if you are unhappy with the guidelines, you should make your views known. The investigator will be given the written complaint and will interview you and the alleged perpetrators on a confidential, individual basis to establish the facts. If you wish, you can be accompanied by a colleague or union representative. Any relevant witnesses to the harassment will also be interviewed. Both the complainant and the alleged perpetrator will receive the written notes of what the other person said. Based on the investigative process, the investigator will then compile a written report outlining their findings. This will be sent to you and the alleged perpetrator for comment before any action is taken. Typically, a course of action based on the findings will be agreed. Both you and the alleged perpetrator will be notified. If you're not happy with the way the investigation was conducted, or if no investigation was conducted at all, you may pursue a case to the Workplace Relations Commission under the Employment Equality Acts. It's a free service. Complaints must be brought within 6 months of the last act of harassment. This time may be increased to 12 months if reasonable cause for the delay exists. And as Karan also said, an employer cannot treat a complainant badly for raising an issue of harassment or for being a witness. Stalking. Stalking is another form of harassment, and a harassment charge can be taken against someone who is persistently harassing you, i.e. repeatedly texting you, messaging you on social media, calling you, emailing you, or calling to your house. There is no separate law for sexual harassment, so the law of harassment would apply if the harassment is of a sexual nature. In this situation, it is vitally important to keep a record of all contact. The specific offence of harassment is provided for in Section 10 of the Non-Fatal Offences Against the Person Act 1997 and is not limited to sexual harassment. This covers what is commonly known as stalking. It requires proof that a person has engaged in persistent following, watching, pestering, besetting, or communicating with the victim. Assault. The definition of assault in criminal law means applying force to or causing an impact on the body of another. This can be punching, hitting, physical touching, or threatening to touch, hit another person. There is a legal difference between sexual harassment, which is not a crime in itself, but which is actionable in civil law. That is, you can personally sue somebody who harasses you in order to seek damages. And sexual assault, which is a crime, and should be reported to the Gardaí so that a prosecution may be taken against the perpetrator. Sexual assault is provided for in Section 2 of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Amendment Act of 1990. This would cover acts of sexual groping or sexually abusive behaviours, or indeed threatened groping. Other more serious sexual offences in law include offences against children, aggravated sexual assault, and rape. Criminal complaints. What if a crime has been committed? If a crime has been committed, rape, physical assault, or stalking, you should consider reporting the incident to the Gardaí. You can also discuss your experience with them without filing a criminal complaint or criminal report. You can report sexual assault at any time, but it is recommended you report it as soon as possible after the event. If you want to report the incident, please contact your nearest Garda station. Now, all of this is very, very technical. We had wonderful legal advice in putting together the toolkit, but if you are affected by any of these, please do seek advice. Please do seek legal advice if required. And there are a number of places where you can go. They are all detailed in the toolkit. That includes the Citizens' Information on Harassment at Work, your Equal Rights Explained, which is a guide to your rights under the Equal Status Act, the Health and Safety Authority, of course, Irish Equity, and again, to remind you to consult with a solicitor who will have the experience and expertise to guide you through your rights and all available remedies. And further advice on sexual assault can be sought from the Rape Crisis Centre, which is, they have a national number, 1800 778 888. It's a national number, and they have offices throughout the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I hand back over to Jane and Siobhán, maybe can I just ask you one question? And I suppose alongside, I know your voluntary work in the area of gender equality in Irish theatre, you've held many management positions, but in organisations of different size and scale, which I think is one of the things we're going to have to talk about later today. And I'm just struck, I suppose, by the responsibility that, I suppose, falls on employers in particular. You know, if we get to a point where we have a system where people can call it out and speak up and make complaints within a proper structure. But do you think we as organisations and employers, I suppose, of all scales are we fully or properly resourced to respond? Like you talked there about, you know, the need for impartial investigators, for mediators, for serious HR advice. Do you feel like, you know, not just speaking about Science Gallery International, but, you know, in general in Irish theatre, are we in a position, I suppose, to implement the change that we're hoping to achieve?
I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it is difficult, given that in so many of our organisations we're already resource stretched. We are time stretched, we are money stretched, and we are people stretched. But that's not an excuse. We can't use that when we have these serious issues to deal with. And I know many people who've come up as general managers, like me, wear many hats. Like we might be managing the finances, we're managing HR and so on. And in my own role, I think HR has become a much, much bigger thing. I think we've all realised that it is not just the people who do your contracts and so on, but have a real professional role in managing these very difficult, very human issues. And, you know, I've had to deal with those as a HR manager, and it is not easy. And I have felt overwhelmed at times in doing that. And I've had to seek professional advice, and the advice is out there. But it can also be somewhat expensive, you know. So that was one of the reasons why we did the toolkit to help people know what their rights are. And it's not something I studied a module in HR in college doing my MA, but it's not something that is easy to deal with at an early stage in your career. And I think we need a lot more professionalisation around this. And I think investment needs to be made in the admin structures of our organisations. They are not an add-on, they are fundamental to making the work and ensuring all of us who make work in the theatre make it in the most respectful and most dignified way for everyone who works.
Great. Yeah, and I suppose I'm conscious here of somebody who works in an organisation that has of a relatively large size with a staffing structure and hierarchies and whatnot. But it's particularly, I suppose, how we support people coming together to make a show on a project grant. You know, who don't have those facilities and don't have that expertise in house. And I suppose it's how we can maybe work together collectively, maybe through the resource organisations of Theatre Forum or ITI, or with the help of the Arts Council, to see what kind of, I suppose, collective supports can be put in place to help organisations of all scales. Because I think I'm going to invite Jane and Siobhán to come to the floor now, who are going to talk us through a draft code of conduct which acknowledges, I suppose, the challenge for organisations of all sizes and shapes. So over to you.
Back again. Just to say everything that Siobhán and I are going to refer to here is in the document that you have in your packs, which is the discussion document towards a code of behaviour, and we will reiterate a certain number of things that Sarah has said. The Amplify toolkit, if I'm not mistaken, is very much from the individual's perspective. So we're kind of taking it from both the employer and the independent artist's perspective. So before we start into what is going to be a very short presentation now, I just wanted to say that for those watching on the live stream, the code discussion document is available for download at irishtheatreinstitute.ie. It's available now. So what is the status of the code, of the document towards a code of behaviour that you've been presented with today? This is for discussion purposes. We're seeking feedback from everybody in the room, artists, producing collectives, entities, formal companies, as well as other resource and support organisations like Irish Equity, Theatre Forum, and also from the Arts Council to inform the final drafting of this code of behaviour. While it is not a legally binding document, it is a draft code of behaviour, the code is drafted in formal language, reflecting its origins in the current Irish legislative and regulatory framework, which both Karan and Sarah referred to, and the listing of that is also in the document. And how did we approach the research and drafting of the code? We realised, along with the advisory group of 7 theatre organisations, the Arts Council and the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, that there was a significant number of codes published already and being used in parts of the theatre sector. So our first task was to review these codes, which was conducted by Arthur Lappin, and we're very grateful for the work that Arthur did. And the sections on bullying, harassment and sexual harassment and victimisation were looked at in particular. The code we're presenting for discussion here today is a distillation, for example, from Amplify and other documents, and an augmentation of what we've read. And it is informed also by the many meetings that we've had and discussions with colleagues and expert advisors.
So what we hope to achieve with the code is to build on the feedback from today and have further consultation with the sector. That in 2018 we propose there will be the standard code of behaviour, as I mentioned earlier, that it'll be in place. It will encompass all employees, workers and employers, that will provide a clear and agreed set of guidelines, procedures, disciplinary actions and accountability. This phase will need to have continuous buy-in from the theatre sector. We must be especially vigilant in identifying and addressing the needs of the freelancers and sole trader artists. In our relatively small sector, most, if not all, of the creative and producing teams are drawn from the same pool of freelance workers. So let's take a look at the code. We intend to concentrate just for a few short minutes on the issues of liability, responsibilities, complaint procedures, both formal and informal. And the reason we're only doing the short few minutes on it is that the details of the code are all published in the discussion document you have. But we feel, for the purposes of this morning's discussion, we're just going to focus on a few headline points, some of which you've heard mentioned by Sarah, but this, from our point of view, this is really taking it from the employer's view.
Okay, so holding slide, next one. Yeah, so who is covered by the code of behaviour? Employers and workers are covered. And workers includes freelancers and contractors. And it also relates to students, interns, trainees, volunteers, and young employees and workers. And who's liable? The perpetrator is liable. The perpetrator of the abuse is liable in the first instance. But this is important to note, that in the absence of adequate employers' protocols to deal with allegations of abuse, or inadequate responses by an employer to reports of abuse, either formal or informal, the employer can become liable also.
So where can the abuse happen? In theatre, bullying, harassment and sexual harassment can take place in a number of work locations. Obviously, there's the workplace, but the workplace could mean the rehearsal room, the theatre itself, the admin offices. Then outside the workplaces, at opening and closing nights, in the bar post-show, in the bar post-rehearsal, on tour, at other places where workers are asked to meet and be there to represent the company, such as training days, festival openings, etc. slide. In terms of responsibilities, all employees and workers have a responsibility for ensuring they treat their colleagues and contacts in the workplace with respect and dignity. And this was already stated by Karan and Sarah. It's really important to note that senior staff, in the creative, technical and administrative roles must take responsibility for the power they have. And management and others in positions of authority have a responsibility to ensure that bullying, harassment and sexual harassment does not occur, and that any complaints are addressed speedily and with appropriate processes. All employees and workers are encouraged to call out inappropriate behaviour as soon as it arises. Empower yourselves. Try to avoid being a bystander where inappropriate behaviour is evident in the workplace. Be proactive and call out that behaviour when you see it happening. This type of language might be useful. That is not appropriate. It makes me feel uncomfortable.
And then when we come to the complaints procedure, there are two. There's the informal procedure and the formal procedure. And it is really important to note, as Sarah also mentioned, and what we find is sometimes we need to hear things and reiterate them time and again until we understand what we can and cannot do. It is important to note that there is no compulsion or sanction for somebody who opts not to engage with the informal procedure in the first instance. You are wholly entitled to go straight to the formal procedure. If you do choose the informal procedure and you have a complaint that can't address the issue with the alleged offender yourself, who is the appropriate person to consult? Your line manager, which in corporate language is quite clear, but in our instance, this could be your director, your stage manager, your company manager, your CEO, it could be a production manager, it could be your producer in the independent sector, or also possibly the employer, HR manager, where there is actually that resource within an organisation. Another trusted member of the company you're working in, a trade union representative, and Karan has talked to the benefit of that support, and also an external guardian, which has been recently introduced in the Old Vic in response to what has occurred there, who would be available from the theatre sector or the union to act in that capacity, somebody who has integrity, respects confidentiality and respect.
Whoever you go to make the complaint to should be sensitive and non-judgmental. Support the complainant by accompanying them to a manager or supervisor if required. Raise the issue with the alleged perpetrator in a confidential and non-confrontational manner. The informal procedure does a number of things. It names and acknowledges inappropriate behaviour. It emphasises that it's not acceptable. It can lead to mutual understanding and acceptance. And ideally, it results in an apology and a declared intention not to repeat the behaviour.
But if you have elected to go through the informal procedure and it hasn't been successful, you may move on to the formal procedure or indeed have gone there directly. And what are the basic steps that apply in the formal procedure? The complaint must be made in writing. You must give details, names of the alleged perpetrator, the nature of the assault or the incident, the times, the dates, the places, etc. And then the employer assigns an investigator, which sounds, it kind of emphasises the formality of the situation, assigns an investigator to investigate your complaint, and the investigator then investigates and meets both parties. If the investigator then will determine the appropriate course of action, which can be either that the facts are admitted by both parties and appropriate resolution and disciplinary action is applied, or that the investigator carries out a formal investigation with a view to determining facts and credibility or otherwise of the allegation. On completion of this, both parties are informed whether the complaint has been upheld or not. And then before any disciplinary action is taken by the management, the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator and the complainant are given the opportunity to comment on the findings.
At that stage, either party can appeal the decision of the formal investigation. And if you're not satisfied with the outcome of the appeal, you can pursue a case at the Workplace Relations Commission under the Equality Employment Act. In the document, we have outlined specific concerns about respect for the performer and issues around touring that we think are particular challenges for our sector. Once we had a draft of this document, we did do some piloting and discussion, primarily with the artists and our Six in the Attic scheme. And from that process, we realised that there were a number of challenges in presenting this kind of code of behaviour to a sector as diverse as ours. And one of them, Loughlin just mentioned there a second ago. I mean, can small organisations with small teams, you know, staff of less than 7 maybe, have the capacity to manage a formal procedure, i.e. be an investigator? I mean, in our own situation, we have 4, I suppose, full-time positions. It would be very difficult for one of us to be the person, you know, a complaint, then take it to somebody who then, and then have a third person who would be an investigator. And while all of that was going on, we'd all be working together. So we really feel this is a real struggle for the small organisation. And we've got 4, I'm talking about 4 full-time capacities jobs. So for those organisations that are come together for periods of time that are short, how can this process be actually implemented? So time frame is another serious challenge for our sector. As you all know, the nature of contemporary theatre making means that most people are working on very short-term contracts of between maybe 6, 8, 12 weeks. And how can you have, how does the sector or the individual producing artist engage with a formal complaints process? In the sense that the process could still be running and the show be over and people aren't moving on to other situations where you're engaged to work in another setup but could all be the same people again. So that's a serious, really serious challenge we need to address. And then there's an issue about coherence. I mean, how can we collectively implement the standard code of behaviour and have a collective agreement on what the standard disciplinary code should look like? We're going to need to work together in the next 2 months to kind of agree what is the appropriate discipline and who gets to decide that. And then finally, we need to really look at how boards can best play their role with regard to their responsibilities to employees and workers. And by that, we're concerned with the board needs to know, as Andrea said, there seems to be a culture of silence. So we're also on boards. Everybody in the room here is probably on a board. How can we be better informed so that we can actually rise to the challenges and take on our responsibilities?
So Siobhán's outlined the challenges, and we're going to have a little bit of time now to talk about questions. And we just want to kind of put these up as sample questions. There are many, but we're really trying to get a discussion going. And the sorts of questions that we've been trying to tease out are around, you know, how do we ensure a code of behaviour that can be adopted across the theatre sector? How do we actually do that? And how can the code be implemented practically in the theatre making process? And what new supports, which I think is really important, possibly the most important thing, what new supports are needed to enable successful application of the code? We need your feedback. We'll just remind you, please do write something, put it in the box so that we can get the temperature of the room. And we imagine that you have a lot more questions other than what we've put up here. So, you going to say something?
Just finally, we just want to say that we did have the report legaled by our board member, Andrea Martin, and we're very grateful for that. And Andrea is with us in the room, so if people have very technical questions on the code and employment law, Andrea may be in a position to answer those.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Great. Okay, as I think we're all very grateful to the work ITI and Jane and Siobhán have done already to date. And I think, you know, we have 2 of our finest players on this particular team, and I think we know it. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to really achieve something together. I suppose I'm going to maybe just leave with one question. You know, I suppose in terms of managing disputes myself or managing complaints, that, you know, and I suppose being able to work within the context of Trinity College and the larger supports and advice that's available there, and a very robust policy called Dignity and Respect, you know, where essentially 90% of complaints are dealt with through an informal process, which actually I think particularly for smaller organisations is a less daunting prospect, where essentially, you know, people are, as soon if a complaint is acknowledged or behaviour is acknowledged, and people can change their behaviour immediately, that it solves as soon as people realise, I suppose, they're causing offence or stress or anxiety, that it's solved. But maybe I'll just open with a question as to whether or not the formal process, which I suppose is arguably a lot more onerous, might that be centralised somewhere within Irish theatre in terms of, for smaller organisations, in terms of the implementation of the code?
Okay. Well, I think what we've realised in the meetings we had with our Six in the Attic and those serious conversations about so just to get a sense of this, we read the code aloud with our colleagues and we discussed it in detail. And what we realised both between our Six in the Attic that the piece that's missing in the way we draft the code, but is very clear in some corporations, is there would be a phase called mediation. So if you couldn't resolve it locally, essentially, you would have access to a mediation process. And as I understand the mediation process that would exist in some corporations, the corporation retains a small number of that would be one way of dealing with it. So that you try to manage a complaint before it escalates into a formal complaint, and that you would have access to that kind of resource. Again, small organisations really do not have the resources to do that, so that may be something that would need to be centralised in an appropriate agency, where you would have access to that kind of that kind of expertise.
Just move closer.
Sorry, the other part of your question.
Well, no, that was pretty much the question. And maybe just to summarise for people who missed that, I suppose Siobhán was saying that yes, that perhaps a mediation service and a kind of a more formal process could be available to smaller organisations through a kind of centralised process. Yeah.
And the minute you start that, then looking, you're completely right. The whole notion of having an investigation in a small organisation. By that, I really mean anybody that employs less than 10 full-time employees. Prospect, and you know, again, that idea maybe an agency would have access to investigators on a retainer, that you could manage that process would be useful.
Okay, great. I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. I'm going to ask you to, we have roving mics because we are recording the whole session, so I would ask you to wait for a roving mic before you ask your question. But if I could see some hands, please, and I'll try and bring in as many people as possible. You wave frantically if I'm missing you. Oh, there you are. Yes, sorry. Sorry, John.
I just want to bring up the subject of retaliation as freelancers and wonder what the panel think about the aspect of anonymity, not just for the people who are victim to abusive behaviour or an incident, but to those who are witness to that also, because they are likely to also be freelancers and may feel that retaliation applies to them as well. So I wonder, is that in the Code of Behaviour?
There is a piece in the toolkit which addresses that, and I think evidence from the Workplace Relations Committee show that there's quite onerous fines, and it's treated very strongly by the Workplace Relations Committee if an organisation is found to retaliate against somebody for making a complaint. And you don't have to make a complaint on your own behalf. You know, somebody can also make a complaint in terms of, I saw this, I witnessed that, and that's probably at the more informal stage of the process.
That's correct, but this is a serious challenge, right? When we talk about the challenges of trying to get a code of practice that works for people on a day-to-day basis, how to prevent how to recognise the retaliation of freelancers in the first place, and then how to deal with it, very serious challenge. But I think that I can say to people who work on a freelance basis, if you experience something like this at any gig that you might be working at, the chances are you're not the only one who's had that experience, right? So we need to try and find a way to try to collect some intelligence on this, because if it's happening within particular organisations, particularly if they're small, you know, that we can build up some intelligence. It is very difficult to make anonymous complaints, because if somebody's accused, there's the right of natural justice and the right to defend themselves, etc. But if we can build up some intelligence around maybe people who are persistently badly behaved and people still, because people are freelance, they don't report, that maybe there's a role for either a central organisation or the union in having those conversations, which we have done in the past with organisations even outside of the arts, to go to a company even where people don't want to complain about a manager and say, look, we're not saying that Mary A or Tony B is complaining or making any specific complaint, but we're saying that we're hearing anecdotally here that there's a problem. And that we would like you to do some retraining for these ex-people, or we would like you to talk to these number of people, because if you don't, then things will move to a formal process and you have liability. And the word liability is a real attention grabber for a lot of people. But it is a serious challenge, and I wouldn't underestimate it. But I would say, you're not the only one. Find somebody to talk to about it, either through the union or through somebody else in your organisation. We have to find a way to gather that intelligence so that we can try to deal with it collectively for people rather than on an individual basis, because you don't know when the phone stops ringing or you don't get called for the gig. How do you prove that it's because that happened, especially if you haven't spoken to anybody about it? So it's, again, serious challenge, but part of the dialogue is trying to find a way to address it, Chair.
And I think it's also part of the need to change the mindsets, to actually move into a cultural shift where we kind of work within an industry where we kind of trust each other, respect each other, and can start to behave differently. But also that's going to take a bit of time to change that mindset. But what we can do is introduce measures, structures, supports, recognising the need for anonymity, independent support, where you can actually have that conversation and get the advice that you need. And that's probably the kind of the short-term measure that needs to happen, is that we need to identify what are those supports that currently don't exist that will actually support the legislation that does exist. Because it's a diverse, has a lot of vagaries, the theatre sector. You work in so many different ways. You can be one day being employed as an actor on a contract with a theatre company as an employee, and you could be an employer yourself 6 months later on a project, a self-produced project with funding from the Arts Council or a local authority. So the way in which the creative works in the industry is multifaceted, and we need the supports, the practical, tangible supports in place to recognise that.
Can I just add, alongside that, I think, alongside the legal and the practical side of things, there is probably a place for a more collective employee assistance program, which is something I only heard of in HR a couple of years ago. I was like, what is this, and how have I never heard of it? And some bigger organisations have it, and it is vital alongside the legal side of things that people are given access to counselling and other moral and psychological supports, because all of this, while we're talking about it in very, I suppose, dry terms here, it is traumatic, and we have to acknowledge that. And while there's a process to resolve it in a legal sense, there are also processes that people need to go through, perhaps both the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator and the individuals involved.
And I'll take another question, but I'll just add that, I think most informal processes allow, you can request that the complaint is dealt with, but that you as the complainant, you're anonymised. And so the employer, the producer, the director talks directly to the perpetrator and asks them to modify their behaviour, but the person isn't identified as made the complaint. I think that's perfectly appropriate. Yeah, question here. Yeah.
Thank you. Another challenge for you as part of the process, but I think it's an important one. What can be done when the perpetrator is a freelancer? Andrea spoke about the known rumours and things like that, that if there are perpetrators who are continually bullying or behaving badly within the freelance world and within the short-term contracts, it's a very difficult thing to address. It's just something to have in mind.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, given that I've said earlier on, I'm still in the black and white place, I have a very clear view on that if you're a persistent perpetrator in the industry, you should have a very short career.
Can I ask you how you'd achieve that?
Well, if you're engaged as a freelancer on a consistent basis by a number of different organisations, and you are repeating your behaviour around the place, why would organisations still be engaging you? They should stop.
Yeah, well, I suppose I would say,
Well, organisations should have a policy of not employing known bullies. It's really that simple. I think we do know some of the people that there have been issues with in the industry, and they're not all in big organisations, and there are freelancers, and it does work both ways. You know, there has to be protections for freelancers and also protection from freelancers. And if an employer continues to employ a freelancer that is known or has been proven to have these issues or be part of it, then they will become liable themselves under the employment legislation.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fantastic challenge, and I'm not like, in terms of, I suppose, the fairness of the process, I suppose, for everybody involved. It's how does somebody become known as a known bully?
Yes.
And how do we share that information amongst the different producing entities and
Without it being gossip or
without it becoming victimisation or a different form of blacklisting. So I think it's a challenge that we've got to address.
If you are confronted, sorry, Siobhán, if you are confronted with your behaviour, and you refuse to acknowledge it, and you refuse to change your behaviour, then there should be no place in the arts for you. That's a clear view.
And do you think that producers should share that information amongst themselves?
Well, I think it should become known. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's really interesting. Great, can we have another question? Right at the back.
Thank you. You flagged this as a discussion point for this afternoon. I'm curious about what you think the responsibilities of boards are for this issue, and also how to ensure equity of reporting channels to boards, that all the information about the company isn't coming through one filter or one bias.
So, very briefly, in the GATE document, which is what you're probably referring to, in the GATE document and the report, there is a section, as you all know, on the board, but it does raise some very serious questions about who is shaping the narrative of the conversation between the executive and the board and the operations of the company. And we don't have the answers to this. We are seriously in conversation with our colleagues about this issue, how to address it. In many of the larger organisations, it would be common for the board to have non-executive time, where the board could discuss issues around accountability, could discuss their business on their own, and then bring the executive in to have that conversation. This would be a really tricky conversation to have, as in our sector, mostly, in my view, to do with the 70s and the Abbey and the conversations around the Abbey and their board. There's been a journey towards almost a conversation between the board and the executive that is almost totally shaped by the executive. And in other organisations, it could be said that there might be a different shaping of that conversation, if I'm making myself clear. So essentially what we're trying to say is, I think that in our governance conversations, we may have to have a situation that every board, twice a year, has time on their own to actually talk about the business of the company, especially in those areas of law that directly affect them beyond the finances, which would be health and safety, responsibilities under dignity at work, and there's probably a few more that are really their responsibility, and they must react to. Now, you know, the Arts Council has run in the past training courses for boards, and maybe this is something that we will be discussing with the Arts Council, and look again at the kinds of training that might be given and how these issues might be addressed. Because the important thing is, we're here today because of what happened some months ago, and recently there's been a report on the board, and we must learn from that report. We must take from it and learn from it, and that is definitely something that is highlighted in that report and is something we're trying to address.
Just to add to what Siobhán says, Tanya, I think it's a really, really important question, and it is one of the ones we don't have an answer for, and why we need the sort of consultation with everybody across the sector to try and tease that out. Because the reality is that as a sector we rely on voluntary membership of boards. And if we can't attract people with the sort of expertise, the knowledge, the support to assist us in making our work and making organisations and it's sustainable in the long term, then we're in big trouble. So we really need to get that in order.
I think it's very important that the board is ultimately responsible for everything that goes on in an organisation. That's the law. Like as individual directors, we are, financially and while there's limited liability with our arts boards because they're largely charities. That the board is responsible for that and it's responsible for everything, and it delegates those responsibilities to a chief executive or directors of the organisation. And I think we all have learned an awful lot more about governance in the last few years, and the new Companies Acts are a lot more onerous on directors and on company secretaries and so on with that. So we have still a journey to go to learn more about that and not frighten people away from taking on that responsibility, and having that proper level of tension between, tension and support of the executives in an organisation, and ensuring that a board is informed as it should be, but is not getting too involved in the day-to-day operations of a theatre or any organisation. But where a matter is a serious thing, like something like sexual harassment, abuse, bullying, in my opinion, should be on a risk register of every organisation. Where there are serious matters which are financial or to do with the welfare of your employees, that is a matter for the board.
Yeah, can I just say as well that I think that, and I think you're absolutely right, in relation to when companies are doing risk assessments, behaviours should be part of that risk assessment. But I also think looking at the idea of worker participation is really useful, that there would be worker representatives on the various boards as well. And that helps to keep that conversation open and stop that sort of one system filter from taking over the conversation.
And maybe, Tanya, can I just add to that, in terms of the work we've been doing, that we have set up Gender Diversity and Respect Subcommittee of the board, and we've asked Rasha Goen, who's just joined the board, to chair that. And we now share both the chair's email address and Rasha's email address in our policy document, and we encourage students and staff to contact them directly if they feel it's more appropriate. Where that then needs to be, in terms of if it's appropriate to pass that back to the executive, that's what happens, but if not, they are empowered, I suppose, to act. And the idea is that we're going to be meeting at least yearly and reporting, and also being held to account in terms of the gender equality targets that we've set ourselves as an organisation. But I think the other interesting thing, and I'm sitting on the Arts Council at the moment, and where we talk a lot about governance, as is, I suppose, right and proper. And we had a very interesting presentation from Mazars recently, and they talked about, I suppose, governance 2.0 as it was in terms of culture and tone of organisations, and how it is the responsibility of boards to inform themselves about the culture of an organisation. I think that's very interesting for those of us who, given what Irish theatre has been through in the last number of months in terms of responsibility of a board to understand the tone of an organisation. And I think that is, in terms of, I suppose, where governance is moving, there is a responsibility on board members to essentially get out of the boardroom, to meet more of the executive, and to try and balance out that conversation in terms of where the information is coming from and how they're informing themselves about how the organisation works. Yeah? Yeah?
Andrea Martin, on the ITI board, and I've been on a number of boards. I must say the ITI board is run excellently. The report that Jane and Siobhán give us are very, very comprehensive, and I think one very practical standard to adopt across the sector would be to adopt a template management report template, that every time there is a board meeting, that there are a certain number of issues that must be addressed. Is there anything to report on the finance? Because I know, having sat on a number of arts organisations boards, that we become utterly obsessed by finance and the conversation trails away if there's any other business. If we must have at every board meeting an item from the manager's report that says finance, HR and company behaviour, any issues arise. If no issues arise, nothing to report. But it does put the onus on the manager to say either we have some problems going on or we don't have some problems going on and the board gets to know about them. Because, as Sarah said, the board is ultimately responsible and the board members must be assertive about requiring information. But I think that one very practical step would be to adopt a template manager's report right across the sector and say a well-managed arts organisation, the director should be, the executive director should be making reports on each of these items and include HR and behavioural culture.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for the moment. There will be time for more questions later in the day, and I know this conversation is probably only getting started.
Can I say one more
Oh,
thing?
and Sarah just wants to say one last thing.
I think we've talked a lot today about what, and we're hopefully a lot more knowledgeable about what the worst type of behaviour is, but we have to also get to the point where we're really talking positively about creating good cultures and what good behaviour is. And until we move the conversation in that direction, we won't be able to create that culture.
Great. And that's a very positive. And Andrea, Irvine, I have to give you the last word. Can you just wait for the microphone? Here we go. Sorry. Apologies.
Yeah, this is just a story that was told to me by someone who had signed our letter, and they were serving on a board of one of the bigger organisations. And one of the problems that she discovered during that time, she did have challenges, but one of the things that she felt was happening was that the board was there to protect the company, and therefore the freelance worker was not being served. And I've never served on a board and I don't know the ins and outs, but that struck me as very problematic. Again, it's the people on the ground, the workers on the ground. How are we served by a board that is actually being put in place by the company and who wants to protect itself and its good name or whatever, but...
I think in short to that, people are the company, and the more we realise that the welfare of people is the welfare of our organisations, it makes it very much more straightforward for boards then to be able to protect individuals and not the entity. There is no such thing as the entity of the company. We all make theatre, we all do the work. There's nothing else outside of it. It's not just the building,
I just will say, just on that with larger organisations, there is a tendency to ask the question when a problem arises, what kind of responsibility do we have for this person? If we don't have responsibility for this person, that problem will have to shift someplace else. And that's kind of the conversation change we need to get to what you're talking about in terms of identifying good culture and good practice. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to leave it there.